All right, welcome. So in this lecture, we're going to talk about the 1920s. We're going to wrap up talking about net. One of the questions I want us to be thinking about is what does socialist culture look like? Remember, as you said again and again, this is a revolution that isn't just going to change the political guard, but change everything. So what does socialist society look like? Well, as we saw in Order Number One in 1917, titles were eliminated. And this is where we start to have, there'll be no sir, madam. Instead, it's comrade, tovarish. Tovarish is comrade, is how people will initially be addressed. It turns out titles will be later reintroduced, a theme of the backsliding that we've seen in certainly in Animal Farm, Orwell's allegory, and we will see more of it. What's marriage going to look like? Now, this for socialist thinkers, there is a large spectrum of thought, is the first thing to say. But the idea was indeed that marriage was an institution that was inherently unfair to women, was somewhat patriarchal, and you can even think about it. One thing that's one debate that many of you have probably heard of in Western society, you'll hear people say, society is just in decline. Family values are going away. There's more divorce than there used to be. And other people will say, well, yes, there's more divorce than there used to be. And one of the reasons for that is because now women can earn, they can have bank accounts. I think even in the 60s, women were first allowed to have credit cards. That maybe not so atrocious because credit cards weren't around for so much earlier. But at first, a woman's husband had to sign off on her having one. And so women didn't have the economic autonomy to really enable them to make that sort of choice towards independence in a marriage if they were unhappy in a marriage. And so indeed, as women have been allowed greater autonomy in society, greater opportunities for education, greater opportunities to earn, indeed, divorce rates have gone up. And then again, so people won't argue about that fact. And then how do you interpret the fact? What does the fact mean? And one interpretation is, look, we're having this decline in family values, and something about society is more decrepit than it used to be. And another interpretation of that fact is, well, women didn't have the possibility of making their own choices and going out on their own before in the ways they do now. And that's why that explains it, not some disintegration of values. So there's just an example, in terms of how to of interpretation. Sometimes you can take the same fact and understand it differently. At any rate, socialists recognize the constraining way in which marriage could operate in economic terms. And some went so far as to call it this bourgeois institution that must, along with other bourgeois institutions, be eliminated. There was never that full move to eliminate it. And certainly Lenin, despite his, affair and somewhat strange marriage, was never one of these free love people. But there is this sense or strain that in the 20s, there was kind of this moment of freedom and reimagining the world in the way that the socialist theorists had imagined would be good. Other historians have come along to say those that characterization of the 20s as this period of free love and freedom until Stalin came along and really pressed it down, um, don't hold so much merit. But I want you to have some awareness of that out there as this characterization that I think doesn't hold as much water as maybe it once did about what 1920s Soviet society looked at. But indeed, in the 1920s, we see a state that is attempting to have a cultural revolution. And one site in which that plays out is in art. This is an exhibition, actually, a bit earlier. This is a picture of an exhibition that was in 1915, work by Kazimir Malevich, who ended up was a very famous artist of the kind of modernist symbolist movement. And so you had this trend in the art world of symbolist and futurist movement. And there was debate. Is culture passive? Is it a reflection of what is, or is cultural is culture radical? Does it help get society to a better place? Nikolai Bukharin, who we'll mention as one of the kind of most high-ranking famous victims of Stalin's terror, what is one of these Bolsheviks who wants to see a radical, active role for art. The symbolists are people that are obsessed with symbols, and they're fascinated with the spectacle of mass revolt. And the artist Bloch even once commented, art is an object of hatred. Now, the futurists had an even more violent rejection of the past. So the greats of Russian literature, like Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, these are, the bourgeois artists that put Russia on the world literary scene. They see them as, they reject that sort of ethos. Although I have to say, Tolstoy, he is an interesting character in and of himself. He is the author of Anna Karenina, which at first is, in some ways, morality. This is simplifying Tolstoy, but if Anna Karenina is the novel of a woman that indulges in an affair and ends up having throwing herself under the train, it is a morality tale about leaving your marriage, not being loyal to marriage. It's a morality tale about infidelity. But and War and Peace is a very nationalist novel celebrating, the nation and Russia's victory in in the War of 1812, and what it means to be Russian, right? And if nationalism can be one of those bourgeois characteristics as well, that a socialist world is going to eliminate. Later in his life, in writings like Resurrection, Tolstoy himself rejects some of these ideas and moves to a more spiritual existence. I'll recommend to you the movie The Last Station with Helen Mirren about late in Tolstoy's life. I mean, indeed, it was the case that if he had this wife and family by the end of his life, he too has rejected marriage and is kind of living in a shed in the back of the estate. So, but nonetheless, for the futurist, Tolstoy represents this kind of backward past that we want to get away from it, and they want to be modern. They oppose the preservation and protection of pre-revolutionary art. And it was Trotsky's wife, Sidlova, who actually headed that committee. We're going to throw everything away and move forward. And so the Bolshevik attitude towards art was very much artist is a sort of secular priest. There's no such thing as art for art's sake. We don't want to look at a pretty painting and feel relaxed. Art is supposed to fulfill a purpose and a political purpose. In helping to change the culture. Lenin doesn't really interfere. This isn't where his attention lies. It takes a utilitarian role towards old art. The Bolsheviks purge from the libraries Plato. He was too idealistic. They purge Dostoevsky. he was too religious. Old art is too individualistic. One of the things about the new socialist society is that there is strength in the collective, right? The individual pursuit of self-interest that is the hallmark of a capitalist society is one of the things a socialist society is going to reject. We're going to think of the collective, think of everyone else. To defend the old art then is too bourgeois. And I want to maybe I'll just share one small anecdote. Um, Back when I lived in Russia, I took three trips to the Crimea because along that coast of the Black Sea are great cliffs and there's lots of climbing. And so I took trips there by train and by plane and by car, actually. So I've gotten there and back all three ways. And when you show up, so I kind of went with a couple people and we split ways a little bit, and you kind of show up at the campsite. And if you're there, you're welcome to the collective meal. And it's just assumed that everyone is going to eat together and everyone's going to participate. Everyone throws in a little bit of money and even organized amongst themselves. And this was that sense of collective. Alternatively, I've been on camping trips where even very small camping trips with there's two or three people, where you'll even have, Americans will sit around a campfire together and eat their three meals. There won't be that sort of coordination. You'll even have two people carry their own stoves, right? So to me, it seems like this is a manifestation in some ways of real cultural differences about individualism and self-reliance versus in a real sense of that collectively spirit that I definitely encountered, and I, in some ways, is a consequence of kind of a socialist ideal that, in some measure, was realized. And so, art that is too individualistic is no good. The goal of art is not to observe the world, the goals, but rather to defend the kind of cultural revolution that the socialists are manifesting. So there's a number of debates about this among artists, but in general, I would say to you, these are small and confined against what we might call, I'm reluctant to use the word among intelligentsia and artists. I don't want to use the word elite because sometimes elite can have this sense of financial, of a financial a higher place in the economic hierarchy, and that isn't what I want to suggest with these artists. But in fact, historians have found most of these real debates are more pre-revolutionary because once the Bolsheviks take power, there is less debate, something we've seen in the party and something we also see in the art world. And in fact, they create institutional organs that will effectively police the art world and what passes as culture, what passes as good literature. When we read Dr. Zhivago, we saw Pasternak was very much demonized almost in the literary guild. So you do have people that want culture to destroy the old culture and create a new proletarian culture. And you do have the Bolshevik state policing culture and art. Now, what does touch more people is mass education. And if the Soviets deserve credit for anything, they deserve credit for creating an effectively literate society. The high 90% of members of the Soviet Union, and this includes, Kazakh nomads on the steppe and in very remote places, learn to read. And so education was very important, and mass education. In 1927, they set a political goal of literacy for everyone and nearly achieved it. Now, initially, education saw the abolition of authoritarianism in the classroom. They engaged, well, there was this movement of Talginism, like talent, genius. The roots of those words were talent and genius, in that we can find that in everyone. There is a more egalitarian ethos. There's also very much a cult of physical education. Just as this revolution isn't just about the political order, the ideal Soviet citizen is kind of a comprehensive, better individual, better educated, better in social ethics, and physically better as well. So there's a lot of emphasis on physical strength. And everyone does their exercises. I've been in old Soviet apartment buildings, and waking up in the morning, and you can look down into the courtyard and see all kinds of people out there doing their stretches, doing their exercises on time together. In terms of school curriculum, theology, philosophy, history, religion, and law are all replaced with courses in the social sciences. Idealist philosophers are banned. In some ways, there's no more need to learn about other idealists because we have found in Marx the proper ideology. Freud, for example, was banned because his emphasis on alienation as the result of something other than socioeconomic relations was unacceptable, right? It's not about what's going on in your head. Material conditions determine consciousness, and that's where we need to focus. There is essentially an affirmative action. There is an intention to bring up the workers, the uneducated, the lower, and these are the people that will in some ways get preferential treatment in college admissions. And there is, noble bourgeoisie that don't get on board in full-throated ways are the bывшие люди. These are the people for whom there are no more opportunities. So what you have is, people that stay, if they were from kind of an upper class background, they would try and damp that down. I remember when I lived in Russia, there was a woman that I associated with casually for years. And it was after years, one night, there was a party and there'd been some drinking. And then her other friends knew this, but she had never revealed this to me before. She sort of said, yeah, my family, I don't really know the details, but we were some kind of nobles. But that wasn't going to do anyone good. So they kept it secret. They don't know the details, but something about some scrapbook that like a grandmother had saved or something, she'd like seen once in a closet. So, this is one of the culture that's being created, and educational opportunities are there for the lower class first. There's a book called Affirmative Action Empire, kind of talking about the Soviet Union. And also education didn't just take place in colleges and universities, not by any means. The Soviets really develop more in terms of vocational training, technical training. Even in factories, you'll have reading groups, rabfaks, рабочий факультет, kind of places that workers, wherever you are, you can get educated. And even people would work their shift and then kind of go to a reading group, have a little factory library, and this became a standard part of things. I actually, even here's another little personal story, was I did much of my research in Moscow, where they have the oldest, biggest repository of super old documents. I'm reading 17th century state and customs documents, but I wanted to be in St. Petersburg. My friends were in St. Petersburg. I'd lived in St. Petersburg, And the documents that I mostly use from the Sibirsky Prikaz are so old that they don't really let you touch them anyway. You order them on microfilm. And so I'm sort of thinking, it's not like I'm actually touching this super old, faded piece of paper. I'm just ruining my eyesight looking at microfilm that's only here. But a professor, now I didn't have the privilege to take the actual microfilm out of the archive, but they had copies, and a professor in St. Petersburg let me. He's like, "Oh, you want to be in St. Petersburg? Great. We like to have you around here. Let me take out for you the microfilms." And so, but I don't have a place for you to read them. And so I'm trying to find places to read them. One time I was in a public library, and a librarian actually came up looking over my shoulder, and she was like, "Is that music you're reading?" Which I just think says to like how different 17th century script is. But I eventually found a really good place to read them in this old construction workers library that was just off Nevsky Prospect, in this little library for construction workers. And I was like, what is this place? And there aren't a lot of microfilm machines around. And this is one of those manifestations of that. Everyone will learn, factories and collectives will have their little place for workers to learn as well. So this is even, in the early 2000s, but there's still that infrastructure left over from the Soviet world. All right. So what does mass culture look like in the 20s? We're going to, what do spectacles and campaigns and holidays and personal names and museums, etc.? Well, we're going to try, what would socialist culture look like? How does a socialist go to the theater? And in 1923, the going to the theater was a mass experience. It was disciplined. It was communal. If you've ever been in Russia, people clap in sync. This is a very different thing. If you're in America, you just clap and everyone just claps at their own pace and there's a cacophony. In Russia, if you are in an audience that is clapping, pretty quickly it will fall into sync. And in some ways, that's just a small manifestation of the collective and the collective life. There are campaigns to eliminate drunkenness and uncleanliness and laziness and swearing, right? We're going to remake the Soviet man. And so here I can show you some pictures, some propaganda. So here, that speaking to that cult of physical education, хочешь быть таким, тренируйся. If you want to be like this, train. Like skinny man, imagining a rich man, a muscled man in the a muscled man in the mirror. Pete Hegseth could have had a poster like this for his dressing down of our general force last week, I guess. Here is a poster with a man refusing, that is what vodka would be poured in. So don't drink, and he is clean cut and he's in a tie and he's eating a healthy meal of meat and peas and vegetables. And we have, let's see, what's our next thing? And here we have Pichat, оружие пролетариата. And that means, print. It's the weapon of the proletariat. And so you have this, ideal red socialist member of the proletariat distributing reading material. That reading material is going to kind of show the way forward. And you see socialism, Marxist-Leninism. Oh, that's so great. I didn't actually realize that before. I haven't looked at it. Here it says, Нет войне, no to war, which is exactly the phrase that's been rehabilitated in 2022 with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Нет войне. And that's for the Russian learners in the class, that's the dative. So not just no vойна is war, and vойне is like no, say no to war. And then down here we have мир, peace. Tune in, take note. this is a theme that we see in later, when we talk about the Cold War. Much of the Soviet propaganda is that America is a a militaristic, hypocritical society that says it wants peace, but it actually pushes war. And this is a line that Putin has very much um, sustained in his messaging about what America is. It's been largely behind his call for America to move away from a unipolar world where America has such economic might and such um, influence over so many other countries in the world. Seems to be in progress. At any rate, the and then here's a poster saying "Всі на борьбу с неграмотностью." So all to the struggle against illiteracy. And so again, the Soviet public messaging, we are going to eliminate illiteracy. Everyone will be able to read. Then here again, чтобы больше иметь, надо больше производить. А чтобы больше производить, надо больше знать. So in order to have more, you need to make more. In order to make more, you need to know more. So kind of here, and you have the sickle of the peasant. So the hammer would be kind of messaging to a more industrial proletariat factory worker. This with the sickle and also the kind of grains as a bookmark, it tells us that this is messaging more to a peasant population. Here again, you see this man blindfolded who is about to step off a cliff, and that is very much a peasant outfit. So this is also geared towards the peasantry. Неграмотный тотчас слепой. Всюду его ждут неудача и несчастье. So it says illiteracy is like being blind, and in this what awaits you is unluckiness and unhappiness. Right? So and there's also, we're going to have public educations for women to, are you taking care of your breasts for nursing mothers? And so even instructions about how to, take care of your breasts if you're nursing so you don't get, what is it? Mastitis can be this infection that often happens early in motherhood. Okay, so those are some images of kind of Soviet propaganda, public service announcements, messages to help create the society and culture that is going to be a better, happier, abundant, thriving world. Personal names. I want to say a personal name. This is what of this brave new world? You start to see people, if you're going to reject the old, well, let us also reject old names. And so you start to see new names emerging, like Spartak and Marat, which are invoking Marat, invoking the character in the French Revolution. You start to see as well the name Oktyabrina. And this is a girl's name. The ina is what makes it feminine. And it's kind of memorializing the October Revolution. You start to see names like Komuna, Fevralina. Fevralina is remembering kind of the February strike days leading up to the Tsar's abdication. There's even a name Rim that stands for revolution and electrification. One of the things is bringing modernity and electricity is a new sign of modernity, are very much part of the Soviet mission. You see a movie, Ninel, sorry, not a movie, you see a name, Ninel or Ninelina, which is Lenin spelled backwards, and the A added for a girl's name. You see the name Marlent emerge, and that is a combination of Marx and Lenin. You have a name Traktorina. which sounds a lot like tractor. That's what it is, tractor. That again, a tractor is the sign of modernization, that we are going to bring farming into the modern age, and tractors are super important in that. So we'll even name someone after it. You have a name Melsor, 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 and that is the first letters of it, which are Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, October Revolution, Renat, and I know a good amount of Renats. Renats is kind of short for revolution, Nauk, Truda. So revolution, science, labor, kind of the things that, idealize our society. And so these are all manifestations of like, here we are building a socialist world. What is going to be, how are we changing? We're really different from that old world. This revolution is, through and through, but they don't have entire success. And in particular, I've pointed out this example to you. Spasiba. Spasiba is actually, it's the word that means thank you. And it comes from the phrase spasibog, like may God save you. So which means kind of thank you. And there was a move to eradicate even this word from the language, but it didn't take. And that is actually going to be a little bit of a theme of the peasantry. So here, all right. And so now we've talked a bit about the 20s, what it's looking like. I want to kind of zoom in for a moment to bring the political scene to us. And that mostly involves Stalin's rise to power. We're going to, before we kind of dig too much into that, let's just revisit a little bit of what we know about NEP. Here's Soviet propaganda promoting NEP, the new economic program that understands in the crisis and inability of war communism, which is basically introducing a total command economy and that socialist dream, eliminating markets, eliminating currency, eliminating the unpredictability and volatility of markets by replacing it with a command economy. In some ways, that's the vision, but quite quickly it's realized the vision doesn't work. And so NEP is a liberalization. We're going to have markets, and there's going to be NEP men that are allowed to, the people that are allowed to conduct business. And here is just a couple pictures of representations of NEP men. Not particularly flattering, right? So this is the grimace of the NEP man. And then here, this is a quite bourgeois picture. And we might say as well that even the curve of this nose is a kind of a Jewish nose, and there is indeed somewhat well, there's an identity politics that goes in along with Nepmen, and 15% of Nepmen were Jews, and there is some, and this may some think have contributed to a lack, kind of a negative view of these people. So, but this economic, this economic liberalization is accompanied by a political rigidification. And Lenin was explicit about this. He says, an army in retreat needs more discipline. And NEP was recognized as a retreat from the economic goals that socialism is attempting to build. And so you see a pretty straight up suppression of Mensheviks and social revolutionaries in the Bolshevik Party. The party does respond to some international pressure, in that there is a socialist movement. There's socialists in Germany. They don't succeed in bringing about the revolution that they want, but they put pressure on these people to not execute SRs. Instead, they're just sent to exile into the gulag. And Lenin bans factions. I mean, he's been trying to do this all along, but in 1921, he really succeeds in saying, we need democratic socialism, which is something of an oxymoron because there's nothing democratic about it. If the party had maintained a role as a forum for debate until this decision, but that is really going to end things. Then you have an atrophying of kind of, ironically, collective ideas and collective discussion. And in one manifestation of this, perhaps, and there's a book about it by the historian Stuart Finkel, is you have a philosopher's steamboat that in I think it's 24, you have many intellectuals that are essentially forced to leave, that they either choose or are forced to leave. The regime does not want them there. The kind of creative minds, thinkers, highly educated people, the regime is like, you're troublemakers, and they're exiled. I kind of think about how in 2022, in the wake of the full-scale invasion, you had hundreds of thousands of people leaving Russia, and by many counts, it was the kind of liberal, educated, most of the 21st century types. And at some level, Putin said, good riddance. These are the people that are likely to resist my agenda. I don't want them. And then it remains to be seen how that brain drain will play out in Russia. Certainly, many very smart and capable economists have remained, and it's one of the reasons that Russia has succeeded in continuing its war effort even now. So here's some of the 20th century. Now, the gist that I want to send you with is I don't know, let's see, how are we doing on time? So NEP is more or less working. You do start to see a bit of a recovery, but it is everyone feels like they have a little bit of egg on their face, perhaps, that you have these this peasant strata, the kulaks, are, well, as I said, this is sort of is it a manufactured branding or not? There are, farmers that are doing better than others. Plus, the kind of state really exacerbates those differences to effectively criminalize kulaks. And then you've got these middle peasants that they say by 1929 are probably 40% of the population. And well, overall, though, in the countryside, the peasantry they might be revolutionary. They might wanted to have been done with the old order, but they weren't willing to embrace Bolshevik ideology in the ways that the Bolsheviks might have liked. And I mean, they did learn to read, but they also continued to celebrate religious holidays, for example. It's kind of one of maybe an example of how there's some pretty hard limits on the penetrability of Bolshevik ideology into the peasants. And that was something that didn't sit well and contributed to hardcore Bolsheviks being able to really see the peasantry as the enemy. And I underscore that because when we see this great break of collectivization, it is essentially unleashing war on the peasantry. Meanwhile, in the industrial sector, there's also a lot that is continuing that doesn't sit well with a socialist vision. So you've got many situations where you maybe have one man management instead of this collective ideal that is trying to be realized. There's differentiation in salaries. That too is seen as something of a problem. There's remains to unemployment remains a thing. This is everyone is supposed to work. Lenin had said he who doesn't work doesn't get to eat. But if the state can't provide you um, work and a job, then what do you do? Women's salaries, despite promises of equality, are much lower than men. And they have allowed, so, as part of NEP, some amount of trade unions. Well, if you had a good working socialist state, why would you need a union as well? So this is the yeah. So that's kind of a sign of a vision still unrealized. And then to say nothing of that, there's these market conditions and also living conditions. It's estimated that in the 20s, you've got, in generally, families are spending 40 to 50% of their budget on food. And that is kind of one metric that would qualify someone for being in poverty, right? If half of your income is going just to feed yourself, you are not living in a situation of abundance. And there's also, you have these white collar workers, right? And there's probably as many white collar workers in Russia as the proletariat. These people want stability, they want management, they want job security. They kind of support the revolution. Um, and this group is going to be a special support base for Stalin. But it's sort of, the bourgeoisie right there in your face in a sort of generational way. Let me, before we go to Stalin, though, let me say a few words about women. I want to come back to women. Or let's see, what else did I want to say? So there's this abiding discussion in NEP. Was it that it was a backpedaling off the socialist original vision? There's no question about that. It's a backpedaling. They said we're going to eliminate markets, and then here's some markets. But historians have really wondered about how to interpret this. Was it the result of an ideological shift? Are some people saying, well, maybe, in real life, Marxist ideas do need some tweaking? Or had the state been experimenting with a radical overhaul that it wasn't going to follow through on? Was NEP just a pragmatic shift, or is this the way things are going to go? One sense is that Bukharin was of the view that, well, this could be the real thing. He was famous for saying, peasants, enrich yourselves, go out in the market, make money. It doesn't sound like a very socialist thing to say. And they were saying, well, this wasn't quite what we thought socialism would be, but here it is. And so this question remains. But amidst this economic backpedaling, we also see, as I alluded to earlier, backpedaling in the cultural sphere. And I want to just point out with respect to women's rights in our last few moments. And here I'm drawing from Wendy Goldman's very good book, Women, the State and Revolution, Soviet Family Policy and Social Life, 1917 to 1936. And basically, Goldman tells us that the socialist vision wanted, and here I can stop sharing now. The socialist vision, what did it want to do? It wanted to eradicate domestic labor. It wanted to have women become more like men, politically engaged like laborers. 3, it wants the state to handle much of childcare. So think about all the labor of, every single woman going home every single day and preparing dinner for her kids. I mean, I'm a mother and I think, God, why do they want dinner every single day? I'm not the first person to think that. And so part of the Soviet vision when they imagined it, part of the vision when they imagined it was like, that's so inefficient. Let's have people live in apartments and there'll be a cafeteria and everyone can go and eat in the cafeteria. And then they just free up all this, shopping for food, making dinner, cleaning up after dinner in all these discrete houses, and everyone can go downstairs to the cafeteria. They even, in early designs of Soviet apartments, there were no kitchens. Like this was how, this is what the vision was. It didn't take. People, for various reasons want to eat on different schedules, have tea in the night or things like that. And so that was kind of a very short and little realized vision. Although dorms, общежитие, where students lived, they don't have kitchens, and there the cafeteria model is very much realized. It doesn't really take for all of society, but this is part of the idea. How can we build a world where people kind of can work and relax and rest? Let's find efficiencies in eliminating domestic labor, right? So that's part of the vision, a vision unrealized. And similarly, there is this recognition that now a few Bolsheviks, and certainly not Lenin, ever advocated free love, but there was a widespread agreement that once the state withers away, the economic and oppressive institution of marriage would probably also wither away, and the state would take on the duties of household labor and childcare that kept women from being equal to their male counterparts. And children would all have equal opportunity of upbringing. So this is part of the vision. But at the end of the day, in that constant struggle between reality and vision, reality won out. And so the Bolshevik state recognized they couldn't marshal the resources necessary to handle all the child rearing and affect the socialization of household labor. And as a result, they backtracked. And then when they had growing fears over the birth rate, the country has been through such disruption. I mean, we're talking numbers of millions dead in famine, millions dead in civil war, and there's more to come on that score. And so they also backtrack on natalism. For example, if in 1885 abortion was made illegal, 1918, the law code on family marriage and guardianship made all weddings civil. It abolished illegitimacy. There's no such thing as a bastard child. There's no social stigma was the idea. It legalized the maintenance of separate property in marriage. This is before women in America can even vote. And the visionaries of these ideas later will be committed to mental institutions, which I think is telling. In 1920, abortion is legalized, but only as a necessary, last resort. In 1926, the law code backtracks. In 1930, there had been a Department of Women looking at women's affairs and how women are doing, and it is eliminated. In 1934, there is a study released showing seriously falling fertility rates. And in 1936, abortion is outlawed in the Soviet Union. And we also see a pro-family campaign, pro-natalism. In 1944, de facto marriage, so common law marriage, is no longer recognized. We're going to introduce illegitimacy as a status for children born out of wedlock. And try and call on men to kind of pay child alimony type fees in a way that in a free world where no one is constrained by that institution of marriage wouldn't be necessary, the government would help. All right, we'll stop there. And next, have a good break. Next Monday, we talk about the Great Break in full. Bye-bye.